Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be moderating the second session of this research day dedicated to knowledge and reimagination in the context of social and political transformations in Lebanon, organized by the Ittijahat. This session, entitled Archiving Transformations, Documenting and Reimagining Reality in Contemporary Lebanon, features two research presentations that explore experimental approaches to archiving and documentary practices in Lebanon within a context shaped by major disruptions. Natalie Rosa Boucher will present her research conducted between June 2024 and February 2025, which explores the institutional archives of the Metropolis Cinema Association and the emergence of Cinematheque Beirout. Noura Waida will then talk about methods of wielding reality in cinema in her research entitled Stranger Than Fiction. In a context constantly unsettled by catastrophes and major transformations, how can archiving and documenting reality challenge our perception and reshape our imagination? While each research project addresses this question from a different angle, both share a common concern on how archival and documentary practices can act as tools for preserving traces and bearing witness, inviting us to reflect on our relationship to history. I will begin with an overview of Natalie's and Noor's research and introduce their presentations. But first, I would like to express how much I appreciated discovering your research paper, Natalie, which offers significant insights into archival practices and cultural memory. As for Noor, it was really a pleasure to be your reader and to follow the process that led to your insightful paper. Investigating the institutional archives of the Metropolis Cinema Association and the emergence of Cinematheque Beirout, Natalie Rosa Boucher questions whether such collections can contribute to the writing of the history of cinema in Lebanon. By examining the institutional archive of the Metropolis Cinema Association as an archive in the making, her research highlights the evolving processes within an initiative shaped by individuals operating in a complex and fragile environment. Functioning within an archival ecosystem marked by fragmentation and loss, the Metropolis Archive offers a valuable lens on post-war Lebanese cinema culture in an ongoing effort to document and preserve this contemporary heritage. This case study also opens into a broader reflection on the archival landscapes in Lebanon, with a particular focus on cinema-related archives that have emerged since the end of the Civil War. It reveals how these collections are continuously shaped by socio-political instability and disasters. The research draws on the methodology of new cinema history, which considers cinema not just as film production, but as a socio-cultural experience. It emphasizes oral history, audience memory, and cinema spaces as vital sites of collective remembrance. Ultimately, the research reframes institutional archives not as fixed entities, but as dynamic processes shaped by people, struggles, and memory work. It argues that the Metropolis Archive is not simply a record of the past, but a tool for imagining and protecting cultural futures. In doing so, it reveals that the archive is also a reservoir of latent histories waiting to be activated through our encounters with it. Noura Waida's research, entitled Stranger Than Fiction, Methods of Wielding Reality in Cinema, draws from a personal experience, specifically a strange encounter with a long-closed Hush Beirout Park on a sunny day of 2014. She argues that living in places and times characterized by major disruptions leads to a renegotiation of the boundaries between what is considered possible and impossible, familiar and unfamiliar, ultimately rendering our previous understanding of reality obsolete. The concept of wielding reality that she introduces describes this process in which an entity or an object appear to us as weird. This estrangement inspired her short film The Secret Garden, which imagines an alien flora erupting from a forbidden garden into the cityscape. Using this film as a starting point, the research proposes that cinema can harness the emotional and cognitive dissonance caused by disruption to offer new ways of engaging with reality. The research focuses on a set of contemporary Lebanese films that blur the line between documentary and science fiction by incorporating real footage and factual references into speculative narratives. These works, showcased in the Stranger Than Fiction film program, reveal how post-apocalyptic and dystopian tropes can emerge organically from real-world trauma and social collapse. Through analysis of 3 films, Odorless Blue Flowers Awake Prematurely, Resilience Overflow, and Archive of the Future, the research argues that speculative fiction rooted in reality creates a cinematic experience that communicates the felt sense of estrangement and uncertainty. The film reflects on how catastrophe is not a future threat or past trauma. It is a continuous present, altering our perception of space, time, and the everyday. The catastrophe is both memory and prophecy, ever present and recurring. We're going to start with Natalie Rosa Bucher's research presentation entitled The Making and Merits of Institutional Archives, Exploring Metropolis Cinema Association's Collection. Natalie Rosa Bucher is a researcher, writer, and archivist. She has been researching Tripoli's cinemas and social history since 2013, while working as a writer, editor, researcher, and project coordinator. Between 2018 and 2024, she worked for UMMD&R as an archivist and researcher, primarily on the Baalbek Studios collection, as well as Tripoli's Société Commerciale Cinématographique. In 2021, she created the exhibition Tripoliscope in search of Tripoli's cinema culture and practices. Recently, she has worked as a researcher for the BIMA, Beirut Museum of Art, focusing on the Ministry of Culture collection. She's currently working on the Cinema Radio Archive in Mina, Tripoli, conducting research for the association Justin Saab, and is a contributing writer of Dalul Art Foundation. She holds a Master of Philosophy in Rhetoric Studies and Disaster Risk Science from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, غادة, for a beautiful introduction. And thank you all for coming. This is my paper, The Making and Merits of Institutional Archives. I dived into the Metropolitan Archive. This quote that I found at the beginning of my research followed me throughout. And I don't know if all of you understand French, so in between archives, history or histories, and fiction, the self-narrative emerges. Archives are a reservoir of potential, but they don't make history on their own. A big chunk of my paper and research tapped into something that I had worked on before, as غادة mentioned, and that is archives in general in Lebanon and cinema archives. So they are often affected by losses, by fragmentation. Corruption plays a very negative role as well. Neglect, as you see, this picture is not the Metropolis Association archive, just to be very clear. It is taken from the Cinema Radio in Mina. There's also an issue around what I call the market value of archives. Archives are being sought. They have a value. So sometimes you find an archive being split up and sold to different people. There's the issue of gatekeeping. Archives should be accessible, but often they're not for various reasons. There's the issue of the legal framework. A lot of people pretend that there are no laws in Lebanon that guide archives. Actually, they do exist, and Lebanon has signed conventions around intellectual property rights. It's just very few people know about them, and obviously they're not being implemented properly, but that would be a way to protect archives. And of course, the climate has often very negative impact. I mentioned some alternatives because it can't always be seen in a dark, negative way. I call it substitution. It's something I've learned myself, is that you feel that you miss one archive, there may be people connected to this archive who themselves have documents or stories or items that can help you in some way recreate this archive. And there's also the question of creativity. I've come across this in two films, one by Dana Abu Rahme, Kingdom of Women, where she was wanting to tell a story set in Ain al-Helwa, and there was no footage, no archive material, and she worked with an illustrator. And Ghassan Halwani did the same with his film. So this is kind of the context of many archives in Lebanon. So at the onset, my guiding questions were, how does the Metropolis Archive position itself among this archival landscape of Lebanese cinema archives? And I listed, of course, other cinema or cinema-related archives in the country. What contributions might it add to the writing of cinema history in Lebanon? Bearing in mind that a huge amount of output on cinema in Lebanon focuses on the civil war and the cinema of the civil war. And there has in recent times been some attempts at writing histories, but there's still a lot to be done. And there's some periods that are kind of like blank spots in this context. And what is the potential of such an archive for cinema studies and cinema culture in Lebanon and possibly also the region? So, as غادة mentioned, my key methodological source was the new cinema history. And the methodology part, I must admit, was also the most challenging part at some point, because I had worked so much with archives, but I had not asked myself these sort of academic questions. When you're surrounded by boxes and interesting documents, you kind of don't think about it. And it is actually Anaïs Farin, who unfortunately is not here today, who was one of my two mentors, who pointed out, like, what you do is new cinema history. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, new cinema history is a concept that suggests that we should move away from the mere film and the cinema output. We should look at everything that happens around the film. Who goes to the cinema and who doesn't? What happens in the cinema when the film is on? Who are the people, the exhibitors, and what is the impact of these films on like a collective memory? And this is definitely something I found doing research in Tripoli, is that films people watched very much stuck in people's minds and impacted them even on a personal level. I tapped a bit into Anne Stoller, who suggests that archives not merely are to be seen as virtual or material storage place, but as a composite social phenomenon. Archives order the world by repelling and refusing certain ways of knowing. So it's also about what is part of an archive and what is not. There's always this question of exclusion and inclusion. Archives are never complete as such. And I looked into the idea of the absent cinema, which some Lebanese filmmakers and cultural practitioners have also looked into. And one paper that influenced me a lot as well was Rinwa Hayek's, who serialized Arab archive and explored this idea of the lost archive. So this image, it's maybe a bit flu, I'm sorry for that, but it's really special. It's actually the first program booklet that Metropolis gave out. So it's from 2006, and as you can see the date, it's 11 to 20 July. For those who remember, there was the July War at that time. So from the beginning also, Metropolis has been very much impacted by history. and events taking place and disruption. So booklets like these were kept at the Metropolis offices. And at some point, a French documentalist came in and started to create an order. And that was sort of the beginning of a shift from this is just marketing material we're keeping to this is now our institutional archive. And an institutional archive is basically whatever an institution may have produced themselves. So in the case of Metropolis, it was all the pamphlets, the brochures, sometimes postcards. What it also included was some posters, and one of the key items were 4 yellow folders that Marie, this archivist, set up, and in which she recorded everything that was going on that led to the making of the Cinémathèque Beirout project. So it was in French, which I was able to read, and it's incredible to have access to this kind of document. There were films, or there are films now in what is Cinémathèque Beirout, but this was not part of my study. So there are all sorts of formats. But was key to my putting things together was conducting 4 interviews. That was with Hania Mroe, the director of the association, with Noor to my right, who was a key part of making the Cinémathèque happen, and Nisreen Wahbe, who has been at Metropolis for, I think, some 10 years. So I was looking for institutional memory. And Marie, of course, as well, who's based in France. Again, the scan is not very strong, but I chose this because I was very happy when I came across this. It's not dated, but I think it was around maybe, can't remember, 2008 maybe, but I'm not sure, or later. But what matters here is the sticker on the top left, it says Cinémathèque. So that means there's been like a shift within the association that when there are some documents where they feel this has to go into the archive or this has to be kept and go into the archive, it would be highlighted in this way. So I'm going on to my findings. In terms of programming, maybe just before I say that, like the fact of having this in-house archivist created a big shift within the association, and the relationship that was established with their own work and what should happen with the material created. Now, when it came to programming, I was very aware of the timeline. So 2006 to 2024 that Metropolis had been running, and the events that happened in the meantime that have been very disruptive, including the financial crisis and 2 wars and protests and so on and so forth. But they've been very consistent in their programming. Like that's one of my findings. One of the key initiatives that they've also been able to maintain were the retrospectives. And in fact, I think just a week or 2 ago, there was a retrospective on Polish filmmaker Kieslowski. So that kind of proves also the point. Talents Beirut, also a strong initiative, where there I found that the impact some of these initiatives may have or likely had on participants has not been highlighted or used by the association afterwards to say, well, we had Amr Shomali in this year, we had Eli Daha when he was not known. And that's actually something I discussed with Nisreen. She said, like, yeah, you're right, we could share this more. One interesting point is that there are collaborations between the association, specifically the Cinémathèque, And for example, Aboudi Abu Jawde, I would call it archive sharing, but also risk sharing, because he allowed the Cinematheque to scan certain magazines, and then they get the digital copy. But we know now, in case of a catastrophe or a war, this can actually mean that you have maybe lost the originals, but you may have kept a digital copy. So on two levels, I found that was a really great initiative. And there's also this initiative of 4 associations finding each other on a common platform called Pilot Libraries. In terms of the logo has changed a number of times. I found that really interesting. I didn't determine what it was due to, but it's also the identity of the association. And it's something that has, in recent times, there's a new logo, and my sense is that this logo may prevail. And there, for those who don't know, this is the entrance to Cinematheque Beirut. In the time that I was doing the research, it was like a temporary space in Mamichael. It was meant to be open, but then the situation didn't allow for that, so it never was. It ended up being closed down, and when the cinema was completed, it moved into this space, so it's part of the whole complex. My recommendations would be that additional records should be added to what the Cinematheque has in terms of institutional archives. For example, press files, parts of the correspondence of core staff. That could be exchanges with distributors or with festival directors. I didn't see any of that. Ticket sales could potentially be published, even tickets, and maybe notes of certain meetings. I saw the catalogs of all the festivals staff attended, but I couldn't say maybe one of them met Martin Scorsese and has a business card of him, but it's not there. Or maybe someone had a notebook and took notes, and they could be really interesting, because for sure some collaborations or connections may have evolved out of this. Of course, the correspondence with general security and censorship issues. Some of that would be, of course, really interesting. The records of the making, so to speak, of the Cinematheque, because they were done by a French archivist, were in French. The present composition of staff, they speak Arabic and English, and with one person speaking French. So it may be an idea to keep the records as much as possible in Arabic and English in future. What I also think would be important is to formulate an archival policy, because I've seen a donation and it's film stock, it's Betacams, old stock, which is a challenge to play even, and then ideally you should digitize it to use. I think the idea of having a clear vision as to what should be added and making the Cinematheque then maybe also like a focus point, it focuses on the last 40 years. So it doesn't really go into the early days of cinema in Lebanon or the pioneers. It could be that like scripts of those filmmakers who have been working the last 40 years may be added, or again, notes or set pictures, or, basically this kind of material could be, I think, really, really interesting. And I think it could also be good to expand partnerships with similar institutions. The region is shifting in very bad ways, but also in good ways, hopefully. And that, I think, maybe makes it, hopefully between Beirut and Damascus, there should be something. The objectives of the Cinematheque Beirut have not yet been communicated. So, as you know, the cinema opened in December. And this didn't actually go into my paper because I wrapped it up. But now we have a few more months that have passed, and I would say it's time to activate the space. Like, everything has been focusing on Metropolis, but it should be made clear to the public, basically. What is a cinematheque? What does it stand for? What are its goals? And to obviously have also activities so that it doesn't come across as what it feels now, which is a library. It should make this step up. My last slide. Okay, here you have two of these kind of booklets that I was looking at. A big shift is on the one on the left. It's very tiny, but there's like a E in front of Metropolis. Those were the days when Metropolis was at Empire Sophile, which also came with a lot of, well, it was expensive, but also with a lot of conditions and restrictions. And the one on the right, it's a bit tricky to see, but it's kind of halfway on the left panel. There's the new logo, and there's no E in front of Metropolis. So Metropolis has regained its independence and wants to make the most of it. Yeah, I just want to extend my thank yous to people who are actually not here, but to Anais and to Rawan, who I worked with, and to Darine and Basil, who I always had on email and now I met, and to Hania, to Marie, Noor, and Nisreen, and as well as the Cinematheque staff, because I spent a lot of time there, to Mahdi, Zena, and Karim. Thank you. Do you want to switch? Or do you want to...
Thank you, Natalie, for your insightful presentation. We'll continue with Noor Waida's research presentation entitled Stranger Than Fiction, Methods of Weirding Reality in Cinema, and we will begin the discussion immediately afterward. Noor Waida is a filmmaker and film programmer. Her films experiment with various forms of fiction writing in cinema. She's a member of the Camellia Committee with Karine Doumet and Mira Adoumiye, and part of the editorial committee of the Montreal-based online film journal Arshfة. Between 2018 and 2023, she was deputy director at Metropolis Cinema Association in Beirut, where she managed and developed the Cinematheque Beirut project.
شكرا غادة. شكرا على الحضور. أنا رح أحكي بالإنجليزي، وهذا منه شيء كنت حبته، بس بعد ما ترجمت هذا البحث اللي كتير كبير وبده وقت بالتفكير بترجمته، وكمان هيك ناتالي بتفهم علي لأنه صار لي فترة بحكي عن البحث فاي. So yes, thank you. So my research is called Stranger Than Fiction, Methods of Weirding Reality in Cinema. So as our experience of reality is drawn by what is considered possible and impossible, familiar and unfamiliar, these boundaries are generally negotiated when major disruptions happen: loss, displacement, war, exile, revolution, natural and biological disasters. These events reshuffle our relationship to territory, to time, to value, and to others. When the frameworks, concepts, and tools we use to define our reality become obsolete, where do we look to find ways to draw the maps of the transformations we are experiencing? Focusing on 3 speculative fiction films produced in Lebanon between 2021 and 2023, Odorless Blue Flowers Awake Prematurely by Panos Abrahamyan, Resilience Overflow by Lara Tebet, and Archive of the Future by Giorgio Basile, this paper suggests that the weird is one of the experiences that can render the scale and the nature of the change that occurs when a disruptive event takes place. Odorless Blue Flowers Awake Prematurely is presented as the journal log of an individual navigating the post-apocalyptic landscape of a city that had seen its end a year ago. Resilience Overflow follows a narrator as they plot to disseminate across a desolate city a genetically modified bacterial strain that can make people more resilient. Archive of the Future investigates the aftermath of the apparition of mysterious lenses that offer views of a distant world. So speculative fiction, for those that are not familiar with that term, is a mode of fiction that generally departs from realism to present magical, fantastical, futuristic, or supernatural elements and worlds. It includes subgenres more popular like science fiction, but also fantasy fiction and weird fiction, among others. It's a form of fiction making that had long been used to express times and places that are in crisis. If we take the region alone, we can think of Ghassan Salhab's vampire film, The Last Man, Al-Atlal, from 2006, Youssef Chabi's crime thriller, Ashkal, from 2022, or even Larissa Sansour's science fiction trilogy that was made between 2005 and 2015, among others. So they all present a dystopian vision of a region on the brink of the apocalypse and navigate landscapes of political and social oppression that threaten not only their present and future, but any ability to imagine and enact real and radical change. The three films I looked at for this paper can be inscribed within this larger constellation of speculative fiction works that are being produced from within contexts of loss, violence, failed uprising, and political deception, be it in Lebanon, the region, or beyond. So what makes the specificity of Abrahamian, Tebet, and Basil's films is their use of what I'm calling recordings of reality to produce the speculative fiction. These are not the only films in the world that do this, by the way. They're just the films that I decided to focus on. By recordings of reality, I refer to non-fiction images and sounds that are not staged. They can be observational images of subjects, objects, or landscapes encountered in reality. Another way to describe them can be as being documentary, but I avoid using that term just so I don't fall into the simplistic genre confrontation between fiction and documentary, as this tends to reduce fiction films as being only fictional and documentary films as being only factual, whereas each of them can contain and weave together both kinds of fictional and factual elements. I chose the films according to 4 criteria: the presence of said recordings of reality, the presence of fantastical, dystopia, science fiction, or more generally speculative fiction elements that provoke a departure from realism. 3, references to real locations, events, and people that seem to insist on signaling us back to reality. And 4, a link to disruptive and transformative events. The 3 films gravitate around one main science fiction trope, the post-apocalyptic. The films do not necessarily take place in the future, but they all give a sense that they are navigating a dystopian landscape unclearly located in time. They were produced in Lebanon in a period, so between 2021 and 2023, in a period that was generally defined by an intensification of major transformative events. So we're talking about the economic collapse leading up to the October 2019 uprising, the coronavirus pandemic, and of course the event that can seem or can be described as an apocalyptic event, which was the 2020 port explosion. So as I was saying, this geographic circumcision is not meant, circumscription, not circumcision, but very interesting lapsus, is not meant to present this practice as exceptional to these events and territory, but it intends to set a clear spatio-temporal framework to fully dive into the intricacies through which disruptive events charge reality with a sense of weirdness. As a side note, this paper is part of a larger research that includes films that call upon other temporalities in other territories. So, by focusing on the dynamics of transference between the weird as it is experienced in reality and the weird as it appears in the films themselves, the main question explored in this research is how do these 3 works proceed to a weirding of reality to relate experiences of time and space that are constantly unsettled by catastrophes and major disruptions. The methodology used in this paper relies on film analysis, interviews with each of the filmmakers, and the use of 2 theoretical concepts that provided the reflexive framework for the research. These are Mark Fisher's concept of the weird, as explored in his book from 2017, The Weird and the Eerie, and Edouard Glissant's concept of opacity that he first started developing. This is something that he expands on his whole oeuvre, but specifically in his theory of relation from 1997. So Mark Fisher describes the weird as being a particular kind of perturbation that involves a sense of wrongness that disturbs our conceptions of things. So generally, something that is weird is something that feels wrong. It feels wrong here and now, and encountering the weird can thus create a sense of alienation that can transform the familiar into the unfamiliar. This is the concept I based myself on to formulate the idea of weirding reality, in Arabic, تغريب الواقع. This is a work in progress translation. If you have other suggestions, I'm open. As being a process through which reality becomes weird, or a process through which we become estranged from our own reality. As for the second concept, Edouard Glissant argues that the way to exist in difference without being reduced, stereotyped, or essentialized is through opacity. In other words, through the understanding that one cannot understand everything that is there. He opposes it to the concept of transparency that he views as the basic requirement for Western thought to understand and grasp the other, a gesture of appropriation that evaluates difference within the West's own framework of understanding the world, reducing it to a comparative process. So just to show you a little bit the type of practices I looked at in this paper, we're going to watch the first, oh wow, there's a lot of green, the first 3 minutes of Panos Abrahamyan's film. So the film is 6 minutes, so we're basically watching half of it. And we'll continue after that. I don't know if it's possible to طفي الضوء. Okay. The effects are very, I think, in line with the theme of the paper. Really good. So this film, Panos Abrahamian made this film in the framework of a commission from the association Aflamuna, which was then called Beirout DC. They made a series of commissions of short films to be done on the one-year commemoration of the port explosion. So when he reflects on the prompt that he was given, so to make a documentary about that event or documenting the state, he said that the only thing I can do is a science fiction film. And so in the excerpt we just saw, we see that there's a striking resemblance between the atmosphere and the events recounted in the film and the post-pandemic, post-explosion Beirut. The loss of the sense of smell, the destroyed city, the fuel shortages, and even the dust, glass, skin, and flesh floating in the air are allusions or indications to the effects of the ongoing economic collapse, the coronavirus pandemic, and the explosion. The film's references to these events provide clues that unsettle the assumption that the depicted scenarios are purely fictional. So the film already kind of puts us in this very blurry space. The film works with observational non-fiction images of present-day urban landscapes and mundane objects, such as sewers, lampposts, rivers, bridges, buildings. These elements are not weird in themselves. The weirding takes place when the voice describes them as such. We hear and see streets, cars, swing sets, football fields, and underpasses, and the narrator refers to scarce resources, destruction, and the end of the world. When we hear the voice tell us that the world has ended, the flowers we see on the riverbanks produce a different emotional charge. They lose their familiarity and become a rare life form that survived the apocalypse. Through an act of montage, these mundane elements become actors in the film's weird fiction. This discrepancy between what we see and what we hear creates a gap that scrambles our ability to perceive the objects and landscapes we see on screen as ordinary. And it is within this gap that a new perception is produced. The familiar appears as strange, and the present starts to look like a science fiction. By anchoring the fictional in the factual and associating non-fictional images and sounds with a speculative fiction narration, Abrahamian's film proceeds to a weirding of Beirut. But for me, this goes even further. He does not depict Beirut as a post-apocalyptic city. He reveals that it is one. So this is only one example of how the weirding unfolds throughout the form of the film itself. In this paper, I analyzed the formal aspects of the three films, but also the creative process and the material conditions of production to show how the presence of the weird in these works is the result of a transference of that charge from the reality the filmmakers live in onto the films. The films transform the way we see and proceed to this weirding of reality. And in turn, the work transfers this charge to the viewer. So the weird here becomes both a condition for and the consequence of this kind of speculative fiction, allowing it to transmit experiences of reality that are perpetually disrupted by catastrophes and major transformations. The process of weirding convolutes instead of clarifying. The cognitive dissonance that it provokes renders things incomprehensible and opaque. They lose lucidity and transparency. The experience of the weird operates within the assumption that we can interact with the world without understanding it, or even that certain elusive occurrences cannot be encountered within the framework of legibility and clarity. This interaction between opacity and transparency is at the core of Edouard Glissant's theory of relation that I mentioned in the last slide. When faced with so much suffering and loss, preservation and documentation become the first reflexes against erasure and extermination. And here we're back a little bit in this, the theme of the session around ways of archiving. And I feel that there's a lot of pressure that is put on nonfiction filmmaking to fulfill that role, the role of preserving and documenting, to fulfill that role, to document, to archive, and represent realities marked by violence, oppression, displacement, and war. But to do this, audiovisual recordings are assumed to be transparent mediums through which a certain reality can be accessed and understood. Assuming the transparency of nonfiction images and sounds flattens their potential to carry the nuanced interactions between the visible and the invisible, as well as the factual and the fictional interactions that constitute our experiences of reality, not just our experiences of films. In this paper, I suggest the process of reading reality as a type of opacity that challenges the demands of transparency related to nonfiction filmmaking in territories and times marked by major disruptions. Reclaiming the right to opacity, as Edouard Glissant puts it, is not advocating obscurity for the sake of obscurity, but to accept that some things are not translatable only because the other is other. This impossibility to fully understand the other is the necessary entry point to engage with difference without reduction. So a way to transmit the specificity of territories and temporalities without essentializing them. Weirding reality is a form of knowledge that places opacity at its center. Lara Tebet, Panos Abrahamian, and Giorgio Basile approach the experiences of estrangement and alienation they lived in the past couple of years through their untranslatability. They position themselves and position us inside the fog of weirdness to relate and somehow document experiences of reality that are stranger than fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Noor, for a beautiful presentation. I will start with a question for Natalie. Natalie, you described the Metropolis archive as an archive in the making, a living, evolving collection. Could you expand on how this ongoing and incomplete nature of the archive shaped your approach as a researcher, and how do you think this status affects its potential as a tool for writing cinema history in Lebanon?
Thank you, غادة. I think it kind of influenced me in that I had to make do with what there was, knowing that there could be more. I think that's really that's how I approached it. And at the same time, I think similarly to what happened with Marie being at the Metropolis offices some years back and starting the process, me undertaking this research created some really interesting conversations. And so I think it kind of gave new impetus to like this making and this understanding of like, oh, it's not enough for us to put this and this and this in the Cinematheque, but there could be more added, and we had conversations around this. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
I have a second question, probably related to this one also, about the gaps that you mentioned in this archive. While reading your paper and the way you trace the trajectory of the archive, constantly shifting within the context of history and geography marked by disasters and disruptions, I could sense that the very gaps that you refer to are part of the archive itself, and how stories might emerge within this dynamic. So as an archival and a researcher, how do you approach these gaps, as obstacles, as openings, or perhaps as narrative agents?
I think they are part of the archive, just like when you have an accident and you end up with a scar. And you're not going to remove the scar. So I was really intrigued that although it's not an old archive, I mean, I've worked with other archives that spanned over like 4 decades. So in terms of, a chunk of history, there was a lot more. But even though it is younger, I did found traces. I found in the notes mentions of the garbage crisis or like some meeting that's not like possible to happen. So it's in a way la petite histoire of the archive, but it's also of the institution and of what may have been included had this meeting happened or had something else been done. So it is part of it, and I really think one has to keep eyes wide open by going through archives, because, I mean, even staff histories sometimes reflect that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalie. We will have probably more questions later. I will ask a few questions to Noor and then open the discussion. Noor, what is particularly compelling in your research is the way that you trace a line from personal encounters with the weird to the act of capturing these records of reality through the camera lens, producing a sense of estrangement within the film that is then transmitted to the viewer. My question concerns your reference to Mark Fisher, the weird and the eerie, and how did this theory inform this process?
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the beginning this the personal event that kind of somehow launched everything. Yes, but I didn't really go into it this time. I think every time I present this research, I decide on a different entry point. But the way that the paper, and I hope some of you will get the chance to read it, it starts off with me describing an event that happened with me in 2014. And I think that was a truly weird event for me, which was the first time I entered Beirout in the summer of 2014, when it was opened up just for a few days. And I'm from Beirut. I've always lived in Beirut. And Beirout was this Bermuda Triangle on my mental map of the city. And I grew up hearing about it, looking at it through the bars, but never being able to enter it. And I remember it was in August, it was really hot. I went in there and the whole experience was so surreal. I couldn't believe that I was standing in that place. And that is for me the definition of the weird, as Mark Fisher explains it. The presence of my body in Beirout felt wrong. It felt like this cannot be possible. How is this possible even? And I think the interesting thing with research is that I had never really pinpointed that moment very clearly as that starting point, let's say. But while writing this paper, it clearly became that starting point. And it now is an inherent part of how I tell the story of this research. So it's really interesting how the narrative constantly changes. And it was also, as I was writing, that this book kind of came to me. And it was Mira Adoumia, who's a filmmaker also, and with me in the collective, مجموعة في الكاميليا, who recommended this book actually 3 years ago, while we were talking about the presence of the strange and the weird in our works. And I had not read it. And I was talking to Mira, and she's like, Noor, maybe you should look at this book. And of course, I, in 2 minutes, downloaded the pirated copy, read it in 3 hours. It's not a very big book, but it's also very fluidly written. And it felt like someone had found all the words to describe so many things that I've been feeling and thinking about and practicing. And so there's this weird thing. It's not a linear thing. So I think the discovery of the book kind of revealed the Beirout incident as the starting point, and they started to inform each other. So there's something that rippled in that way. Yeah, and then that I think I had the term of weirding. The first time I heard it was talking to Panos. He was telling me about this phenomenon of global weirding, which I'm still not very sure what it is. I tried to research about it and I'm not understanding it fully. So I took that word, the weirding of a process of something becoming weird, and kind of, develop the concept around it.
This is important, this shift, that becoming weird at one point, there is a shift that is happening. have another question about the temporality. Your work introduces a temporality in which catastrophe is no longer confined to the past or projected to the future, but is instead experienced as an ongoing, repetitive present. In relation to Panos Arpaion's film and Lara Taib's films, you argue that the end of the world is already happening, not in the past or the future, but in the present. And when discussing Giorgio Basil's film Archive of the Future, you suggest that the catastrophe is not only past and present, but also perpetual. That is simultaneously past, present, and future, meaning that the end of the world will always be happening. Can you comment on this temporality of catastrophe and how did it emerge through your research?
This question is very... I'll tell you why I'm laughing. Because this is a theory that غادة talks about in her research, the temporality of the catastrophe.
You talk about it too.
Yes. But it's like I think it's very influenced by one thing that غادة, a series of poems that غادة started to write, of poetic fragments, started to write in 2020, called "The End of the World Has Already Occurred," has already happened. I think you translated occurred, right? Yeah. La fin du monde a déjà eu lieu. And I think there is that idea. This is, for example, the basis of the whole Afrofuturist movement, that any colonized people, the dystopia is not ahead of them, is behind them. And so you're already post-catastrophe, post-apocalypse. So all the futurisms kind of fall into that idea. But for me, it's going a bit further, as you're saying, and not only saying, okay, the end of the world has already happened, because we can see, I think it's a multi-step process that first, when we're projecting the end of the world as something in the future, there's always the imagination that when the end of the world happens, everything ends. So nothing comes after it, right? And one of the first shocks of the explosion, for example, was that, no, it didn't. The world didn't end. It was the end of the world. It felt like the end of the world, but things also kept going. There was a tomorrow.
There was another reference, I forgot the name of the author, that says that the explosion is...
طارق أبي سمرة. Yes.
Continues.
Yes. القنبلة سوف تنفجر. سوف تستمر أن تنفجر. He wrote an article in Megaphone on the 14th of August 2020, so 10 days after the explosion. Beautiful article, talking about the fact that this bomb, this explosion has already happened, will happen, and that the catastrophe, and the catastrophe is not the fact that this is unprecedented, but that it is familiar.
Normal.
Yeah. And so I lost my train of thoughts, but yes.
Sorry.
So no, not at all. I feel like I opened a million doors, So I think in the example that I showed from Panos' film, and Lara's film works in a similar way, where it's assuming that anything that we will record of the city is a recording of a dystopia. But Giorgio Basil's film goes even further, and I didn't talk about it at all because I didn't have the time, but it's a fascinating film that really convolutes temporalities, and it is in this film where this temporality of the catastrophe, so the fact that this is always gonna be happening, that it really unfolds. And maybe I finish off with something that what Rami said, Rami Sabbagh. Yes, so he always describes the moment after the explosion as all the... So Rami Sabbagh is a musician and a filmmaker, and he says that all the glass from the exploded windows, and etc., came into our eyes, and so we can never see in the same way again. And that's the idea of the perpetual. So there's something that is modified inherently. Yeah.
And you related to the fog also that you talk about?
Yes, so I think it relates to the idea of opacity and transparency, and the idea of the fog, which is also an element that Karine Doumet explores in a not small short story that she wrote, where she speaks of the fog as this element that is capable of helping us to see by blurring. So it's the same idea of the glass that comes into our eyes but helps us reveals other things, even though it's obstructing our vision in certain ways. Yeah.
Does anyone have any question or comments? Okay, so we will end on this note. Thank you.